In the autumn of 1897, deep within the industrial heart of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, there existed a hospital that the living tried desperately to forget. St. Lazarus Hospital for the Terminally Ill stood on a hill overlooking the Monongahela River, its Victorian towers piercing the smoke-filled sky like accusing fingers. The locals whispered about it in hushed tones, crossing themselves when they passed its iron gates. But what they whispered about wasn't the dying patients inside. It was about what happened after those patients stopped breathing. Because at St. Lazarus, death was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a nurse's most important work. The story begins on a cold October morning when 23-year-old Margaret Sullivan arrived at the hospital's front entrance, her leather medical bag clutched tightly in her gloved hands. She had traveled 3 days by train from Boston, answering an advertisement that promised excellent pay and housing for qualified nurses willing to work with terminal patients. Margaret needed both desperately. Her father's debts had consumed everything after his death 6 months earlier, leaving her with nothing but her nursing diploma and a fierce determination to rebuild her life. The hospital's head administrator, Mrs. Cordelia Blackwell, met her in the entrance hall. She was a tall woman in her 50s, dressed entirely in black. Her silver hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her pale skin across her sharp cheekbones. Her eyes were the color of winter ice, and they studied Margaret with an intensity that made the younger woman shift uncomfortably on the marble floor. Mrs. Blackwell led Margaret through corridors that smelled of carbolic acid and something else, something sweet and cloying that Margaret couldn't quite identify. The gas lights flickered as they passed, casting dancing shadows on the green-painted walls. They climbed 3 flights of stairs, their footsteps echoing in the silence, until they reached a heavy oak door marked with a brass plate that read Nurses' Quarters. Inside, Margaret found a small but clean room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the city's smoky skyline. Mrs. Blackwell stood in the doorway, her hands folded at her waist. "Your duties will begin at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. You will care for patients on the 4th floor, East Wing. Most of them have consumption. Some have cancer. A few have diseases the doctors cannot name. Your primary responsibility is to ensure their comfort during their final days." Margaret nodded, setting down her bag. She had nursed dying patients before during her training. It was difficult work, emotionally draining, but she considered it the most meaningful service a nurse could provide. Mrs. Blackwell continued, her voice dropping lower. "There is, however, a secondary responsibility that you must understand before you accept this position. A responsibility that is not discussed in polite company, but is absolutely essential to the work we do here at St. Lazarus." Margaret felt a cold prickle run down her spine. She waited, watching the older woman's face for some hint of what was coming. "When a patient dies under your care, you will not immediately summon the undertaker. Instead, you will follow the protocols outlined in the manual you will receive tonight. These protocols have been developed over many years and must be followed precisely. They involve certain procedures designed to maintain the appearance of life for a specific period after death has occurred." Margaret's mouth went dry. "I don't understand. Why would we pretend someone is alive when they've died?" Mrs. Blackwell's expression remained unchanged. "We do not pretend, Miss Sullivan. We preserve. There are medical and legal reasons that you will come to understand. For now, you need only know that this hospital has contracts with certain families who require this service. They pay generously for it. That is how we afford to provide such excellent care to all our patients, including those who cannot pay." The explanation made no sense to Margaret, but she found herself nodding anyway. She needed this position too badly to ask the questions that were forming in her mind. Questions about why families would want their deceased loved ones kept in this strange state of artificial animation. Questions about what exactly these protocols entailed. Mrs. Blackwell handed her a thick, leather-bound book. "Study this tonight. Tomorrow you will observe Nurse Patterson as she demonstrates the procedures. You will not speak of what you learn to anyone outside this hospital. The contract you signed includes a confidentiality clause with severe financial penalties for violations." Margaret took the book, feeling its unexpected weight in her hands. As Mrs. Blackwell turned to leave, the younger woman finally found her voice. "What happens if I refuse? if I decide this isn't the kind of nursing I want to practice?" The administrator paused in the doorway, glancing back over her shoulder. Her smile was thin and cold. "Then you will find that your nursing diploma has been revoked for reasons of professional incompetence, and no hospital in America will hire you. We have connections throughout the medical establishment, Miss Sullivan. Choose wisely." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Margaret alone with the mysterious book and the growing certainty that she had just made a terrible mistake. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat on her narrow bed, the leather-bound manual open on her lap, reading by the light of a single candle. What she found in those pages made her blood run cold, then hot with anger, then cold again with a creeping horror she couldn't shake. The manual was written in precise medical language, describing in meticulous detail how to maintain what it called vital appearances in deceased patients. There were instructions for using specialized cosmetics to maintain skin color, techniques for positioning bodies to simulate breathing, methods for keeping eyes open and responsive looking through the use of thin wires and chemical solutions. There were even procedures for creating the illusion of warmth by placing heated bricks beneath the bedding at strategic intervals. But the most disturbing sections dealt with what the manual called animation protocols. These involved complex schedules for moving the deceased patient's limbs, turning their heads, adjusting their positions, all timed to coincide with visiting hours. There were scripts for nurses to follow, explanations they could give to family members about why their loved one seemed so still, so quiet, so distant. Margaret's hands shook as she turned the pages. This wasn't medicine. This was theater. Macabre, cruel theater performed on the bodies of the dead for reasons she still couldn't fathom. She considered leaving. She could pack her bag right now, slip out before dawn, take the first train back to Boston. But Mrs. Blackwell's threat echoed in her mind. Her nursing career would be destroyed. She would have no way to support herself, no way to pay off her father's remaining debts. She would end up in a factory or worse, and everything she had worked for would be lost. Dawn came slowly, the grey light creeping across her floor like something reluctant and ashamed. Margaret dressed in her nursing uniform, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the pale, hollow-eyed woman staring back. At precisely 6 o'clock, she made her way to the 4th floor east wing. The corridor was longer than she expected, lined with doors on both sides. Most were closed, but through the gaps beneath them, she could see slices of yellow lamplight. The air was thick with that same sweet, cloying smell she had noticed yesterday, stronger now, almost nauseating. Nurse Patterson was waiting for her outside room 412. She was a woman in her 40s, stout and practical-looking, with kind eyes that seemed at odds with the work she performed. She greeted Margaret with a warm smile that somehow made everything worse. "Good morning, dear. I'm Helen Patterson. Don't look so frightened. I know the manual is overwhelming at first, but you'll find the actual work is quite manageable once you understand the purpose behind it." Margaret struggled to keep her voice steady. "I'm not sure I do understand the purpose. Mrs. Blackwell mentioned contracts with families, but why would anyone want this?" Helen's expression softened with something like pity. "Come with me. I'll show you." She opened the door to room 412 and Margaret followed her inside. The room was larger than she expected, furnished more like a bedroom in a wealthy home than a hospital ward. Heavy velvet curtains framed the windows, a Turkish carpet covered the floor. In the center of the room stood an ornate brass bed, and in that bed lay an elderly man. He was propped up on pillows, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling. His skin had a waxy quality that Margaret recognized immediately. She had seen enough dead bodies during her training to know what death looked like, and this man was unquestionably dead. Yet someone had arranged him carefully, dressed him in expensive silk pajamas, positioned his hands on top of the coverlet as if he were simply resting. Helen moved to the bedside with practiced efficiency. "This is Mr. Edward Thornton. He died 3 days ago of heart failure. His daughter visits every afternoon at 2 o'clock. She sits with him for exactly 1 hour, holding his hand, talking to him about her day, her children, the weather. She has been doing this for a week now." Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. "But he's dead. She knows he's dead, doesn't she?" Helen began her routine, adjusting the pillows, smoothing the coverlet, touching the man's face with a tenderness that seemed genuine despite the grotesque circumstances. Of course she knows, but she isn't ready to let go. Her father was a difficult man in life, cold and demanding. She never had the relationship with him that she wanted. Now she's been given the opportunity to say goodbye properly, to have the conversations she never had, to make her peace. In 2 more days she'll be ready. Then we'll call the undertaker, and Mr. Thornton will finally be laid to rest. Margaret watched in horrified fascination as Helen demonstrated the morning routine. She applied fresh cosmetics to the dead man's face, using rouge to simulate color in his cheeks. She used small amounts of glycerin to keep his lips from drying out. She adjusted the position of his head slightly, turning it toward the window as if he were watching the sunrise. "The families pay for this," Helen explained as she worked. "They pay very well. Some of them just need a few extra days. Others need weeks. We had one patient who remained here for nearly 2 months while his wife worked through her grief. It's a service, Margaret. A kindness, really, when you think about it." Margaret couldn't think about it. Her mind refused to process what she was witnessing. This wasn't kindness. This was madness, a violation of something fundamental and sacred. But as Helen continued her demonstration, moving on to show her how to create the illusion of breathing, how to warm the bedding, how to position the body for visiting hours, Margaret realized something that made her feel sick with shame. A part of her, a small, traitorous part, was fascinated by the technical precision of it all, the careful attention to detail, the almost artistic dedication to maintaining the illusion. It was wrong, deeply wrong, but it was also strangely compelling in its thoroughness. "Your first patient is in room 416, Helen said as she finished. "Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell. She passed away yesterday evening. Her son will arrive from New York this afternoon. You have 6 hours to prepare her." Margaret stood outside room 416 for a full minute before she could bring herself to open the door. Her hand trembled on the brass doorknob. Everything in her training, everything she believed about medicine and dignity and the sanctity of death, screamed at her to turn around and leave this place. But her feet stayed planted on the polished wooden floor, and her hand eventually turned the knob. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell lay in her bed exactly as she had died. No one had touched her yet. Her mouth hung open slightly, her eyes were half closed, and her skin had already begun to take on that greyish pallor that Margaret had learned to recognize during her training. She was a small woman, perhaps 70 years old, with white hair spread across her pillow like a halo. Even in death, there was something gentle about her face, something that suggested she had been kind in life. Margaret approached the bed slowly, her nursing bag heavy in her hand. Inside were the supplies Helen had given her, the cosmetics, the wires, the chemical solutions, the manual with its detailed instructions. She set the bag on the bedside table and just stood there, looking down at Mrs. Hartwell's peaceful face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for what I'm about to do to you." She opened the manual to the section on initial preparation and began to read. The first step was to close the mouth and eyes properly, using small amounts of adhesive to keep them in the desired position. Then came the cleaning and positioning of the body. Then the application of preservative solutions to slow decomposition. Each step was described with clinical precision, as if this were any other medical procedure. Margaret's hands shook as she began the work. She told herself she was just following instructions, just doing what she had been hired to do. But with each step, she felt something inside her hardening, calcifying. She was crossing a line and she knew it. Once this was done, she could never uncross it. The morning passed in a blur of horrible tasks. She found herself falling into a kind of mechanical routine, her mind disconnecting from what her hands were doing. It was the only way she could continue. By noon, Mrs. Hartwell looked almost alive again. Her color had been restored through careful application of cosmetics. Her eyes were open just enough to seem restful, rather than dead. Her mouth was set in a slight smile that Margaret had created using tiny amounts of wax and adhesive. The transformation was remarkable and revolting in equal measure. Helen checked on her progress just after 1 o'clock. She walked around the bed, examining Margaret's work with a critical eye. Then she nodded approvingly. "Very good for your first time. You have steady hands and attention to detail. Mrs. Hartwell looks peaceful. Her son will be comforted by that. Margaret wanted to scream that her son should be told the truth, that his mother was dead and deserved to be buried with dignity, not kept here like some grotesque doll. But she said nothing. She just nodded and cleaned her supplies, placing them back in her bag with movements that felt automatic, detached from any conscious thought. The son arrived at 2:30. Margaret was preparing to leave the room when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Helen touched her arm gently. "Stay. You need to observe how we handle the visits. It's an important part of the protocol." A man in his mid-40s entered the room. He was well dressed, with the bearing of someone used to authority and respect, but when he saw his mother lying in the bed, his face crumpled with grief so raw that Margaret had to look away. He moved to the bedside and took his mother's hand, the hand that Margaret had positioned carefully just an hour ago, the hand that was cool to the touch despite the heated bricks beneath the mattress, the hand of a dead woman. "Hello, Mother," he said, his voice breaking. "I came as soon as I received the telegram. I'm here now. I'm here." Helen stepped forward smoothly, her voice gentle and professional. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Nurse Patterson. I've been caring for your mother. She's resting comfortably now. The doctor said she's stable, but we're monitoring her closely." The lies came so easily from Helen's lips that Margaret felt dizzy with the wrongness of it. She watched as the son settled into the chair beside the bed, still holding his mother's hand, talking to her in soft tones about his journey, his family, his regrets about not visiting sooner. This went on for an hour. An hour of watching a grieving man pour his heart out to a corpse. An hour of maintaining the terrible illusion. Margaret stood near the window, trying to be invisible, trying not to be complicit in this cruelty. But of course she was complicit. She had prepared the body. She had created the illusion that was allowing this man's false hope to continue. When he finally left, promising to return the next day, he looked lighter somehow, as if the visit had eased something in his soul. Helen saw Margaret's expression and nodded. "Now you see. Now you understand why we do this. That man needed to see his mother one more time. He needed to say goodbye at his own pace, not have it forced upon him by death's schedule. We give families that gift. Is it unconventional? Yes. Is it misunderstood? Certainly. But is it cruel? No, Margaret. It's one of the kindest things we can do." Margaret wanted to believe her. Some part of her desperately wanted to believe that there was nobility in this work, that she wasn't simply desecrating the dead for money. But another part, the part that had studied medicine and ethics, the part that had taken an oath to do no harm, knew that this was wrong, fundamentally, irredeemably wrong. That evening, alone in her room, Margaret made a decision. She would stay at St. Lazarus, but only long enough to understand what was really happening here. Something about this entire operation felt wrong in ways that went beyond the obvious moral violations. The contracts Helen had mentioned, the wealthy families willing to pay enormous sums for this service, Mrs. Blackwell's threat about her nursing diploma. There was something deeper here, something hidden beneath the surface of this grotesque theatre, and Margaret was going to find out what it was. The next 2 weeks passed in a nightmarish routine that Margaret began to navigate with increasing numbness. Each morning brought new tasks of preservation and presentation. Each afternoon brought grieving families who sat beside the dead, speaking to them, touching them, finding comfort in an illusion that Margaret helped maintain. She learned the techniques quickly. How to adjust a body's position to suggest sleep rather than death. How to use lighting and cosmetics to hide the inevitable signs of decay. How to speak to visitors with just the right balance of hope and gentle concern. She also learned the unspoken hierarchy of St. Lazarus. There were the regular nurses like herself and Helen, who handled the daily maintenance of the deceased patients. Then there were the senior nurses, who managed the more complex cases, the bodies that had been kept for weeks or even months. Above them was Mrs. Blackwell, who handled all communications with the families and managed the financial arrangements. And somewhere above even her, shadowy figures that Margaret never saw, but whose presence was felt in every corner of the hospital. By her 3rd week, Margaret was caring for 5 patients simultaneously. Mr. Thornton had finally been released to his family for burial after his daughter completed her extended goodbye. Mrs. Hartwell's son had visited 7 times before he was gently informed that his mother had passed peacefully in the night. The fiction was maintained until the very end. New patients arrived regularly. Some died in the hospital. Others, Margaret began to suspect, were already dead when they arrived, though the paperwork always indicated otherwise. She kept her observations in a small notebook she hid beneath her mattress. She recorded names, dates, fees she overheard mentioned, suspicious details about how and when patients arrived. She didn't know yet what she would do with this information, but some instinct told her it would be important. It was on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks into her employment, that Margaret discovered the basement. She had been working late, preparing a new arrival for viewing the next morning, when she realized she had run out of the special preservative solution they used. The supply room was on the 2nd floor, but when she arrived she found it locked. A note on the door indicated that additional supplies were available in the basement storage area. Margaret had never been to the basement. It wasn't part of her regular duties, and something about the way the other nurses avoided mentioning it made her instinctively avoid it as well. But she needed the solution, and the supply room wouldn't be unlocked until morning. She took one of the gas lamps from the hallway and found the narrow staircase that led down. The basement was cold and damp, nothing like the well-maintained floors above. The walls were rough stone, and the air smelled of earth and something chemical that burned her nostrils. She followed the corridor, her lamp casting wild shadows on the walls, until she found a door marked storage. It was unlocked. Inside she found the preservative solutions, dozens of bottles arranged on metal shelving. But she also found something else. Filing cabinets, lots of them, filling an entire wall of the room. Margaret knew she should take the solution and leave. But her curiosity, the same curiosity that had driven her into nursing despite her father's objections, made her set down her lamp and open one of the cabinet drawers. Inside were files, patient files, but not like any she had seen before. These contained detailed financial records, contracts with families, payment schedules. But more than that, they contained correspondence, letters between Mrs. Blackwell and various wealthy individuals across the country. And as Margaret began to read, her blood ran cold. The families weren't paying for a few extra days with their deceased loved ones. They were paying for something far more calculated. Many of the letters discussed inheritance disputes, wills that required a person to survive beyond a certain date, insurance policies that paid out differently depending on the exact time of death, legal battles that could be won or lost based on when precisely someone was declared deceased. St. Lazarus wasn't providing a compassionate service for grieving families. It was selling time, buying and selling the exact moment of death for people who had already died, manipulating legal and financial outcomes through falsified death certificates and carefully orchestrated deceptions. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled out file after file. Mr. Thornton had been kept alive for an extra week because his daughter needed him to survive past his birthday to trigger a trust fund clause. Mrs. Hartwell's son had paid to delay her death certificate by 10 days to avoid a property transfer that would have been contested by his siblings. Every patient Margaret had cared for had been part of some legal or financial manipulation. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Someone was coming. Margaret quickly closed the cabinet and grabbed the bottle of preservative solution. She was halfway to the door when Mrs. Blackwell appeared in the doorway, blocking her exit. The older woman's face was calm, but her eyes were hard as flint. "Miss Sullivan, working late, I see." Margaret held up the bottle with a hand she tried to keep steady. "I ran out of solution. The supply room upstairs was locked." Mrs. Blackwell's gaze moved to the filing cabinets, then back to Margaret. "And did you find what you were looking for?" There was no point in lying. Margaret could feel the weight of the notebook hidden in her room, all her careful observations. She could feel the weight of everything she had just discovered. She straightened her spine and met Mrs. Blackwell's eyes directly. "I found the truth. You're not helping grieving families. You're manipulating legal documents, committing fraud, using dead bodies as props in elaborate schemes to steal money." Mrs. Blackwell's expression didn't change. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. The soft click of the latch seemed very loud in the sudden silence. "What you call fraud, Miss Sullivan, our clients call justice. Do you know how many of those grieving families have been cheated by legal technicalities? How many rightful inheritances have been denied because someone died a day too soon? We provide a service that allows people to correct the injustices of circumstance and timing. We help them get what should rightfully be theirs. Margaret shook her head. You help them lie and steal, and you've made me complicit in it. Mrs. Blackwell smiled then, a thin, cold expression. You made yourself complicit the moment you accepted this position. You read the manual, you prepared the bodies. You maintained the illusions for the visitors. You knew something was wrong, but you did it anyway because you needed the money. We're not so different, you and I. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow because they were partially true. She had known something was wrong. She had felt it from the beginning. But she had pushed aside her doubts, her ethical concerns, because she needed this job, because she was afraid of being poor, of being powerless, of losing everything like she had when her father died. What happens now? Margaret asked quietly. Mrs. Blackwell studied her for a long moment. That depends on you. You can continue your employment here with full knowledge of what we do. Your salary will increase substantially. You'll be trusted with more complex cases. Or you can leave tonight with your severance pay and a letter of recommendation. But if you choose to leave, you must understand that any attempt to expose what you've learned will result in consequences. Not just the destruction of your nursing career, but criminal charges for your participation. We have documentation of everything you've done here, Miss Sullivan. Every body you prepared, every family you deceived. It was a trap. It had always been a trap. Margaret had walked into it willingly, and now she was caught. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat on her bed, staring at the wall, trying to understand how her life had led her to this moment. She thought about her father, about the debts that had driven her here. She thought about the oath she had taken when she became a nurse, the promise to care for the sick and honor the dignity of all patients, living or dead. She thought about the families she had helped deceive, the legal systems she had helped corrupt. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would stay. Not because she accepted what St. Lazarus was doing, but because leaving would accomplish nothing. Mrs. Blackwell's threat was real. If Margaret walked away, she would be silenced by the threat of prosecution, and the hospital would continue its operations untouched. But if she stayed, if she gained Mrs. Blackwell's trust, she might be able to gather enough evidence to expose the entire operation in a way that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. It was a dangerous plan. It required her to become more deeply involved in the very crimes she wanted to expose. But Margaret couldn't see another way forward. When Mrs. Blackwell summoned her that morning, Margaret accepted the promotion and the increased salary without hesitation. She watched the older woman's face carefully, looking for any sign of suspicion, but Mrs. Blackwell seemed satisfied with her decision. Over the following weeks, Margaret was given access to more sensitive information. She learned that St. Lazarus was just one facility in a network of similar hospitals across the country. She learned the names of lawyers and judges who were complicit in the scheme, who falsified death certificates and manipulated court proceedings. She learned that some of the patients brought to St. Lazarus had not died of natural causes at all, but had been helped along when their continued survival became inconvenient to their families. This last discovery shook her more than anything else. She found the evidence in a file belonging to a man named Robert Ashford, who had supposedly died of pneumonia. But the medical notes, the real ones kept in the basement files, told a different story. He had been in perfect health until he was administered a dose of morphine far beyond therapeutic levels. The death had been ordered by his nephew, who stood to inherit a considerable fortune. Margaret copied the information carefully into her hidden notebook. She began making trips to the basement regularly, always under the pretense of getting supplies, always copying files when she was alone. She memorized names, dates, amounts of money. She collected evidence of murders disguised as medical care, of fraud that had enriched dozens of wealthy families while corrupting the entire legal system. But the work was taking its toll. Every day she had to maintain her role, had to prepare bodies and deceive families, and pretend that what she was doing was acceptable. She felt herself changing, hardening. The horror that had overwhelmed her in those first weeks had given way to a cold determination that frightened her. She was becoming the kind of person who could look at a corpse and see only evidence, who could smile at grieving families while planning their exposure. 3 months into her secret investigation, Margaret made contact with a newspaper reporter in Philadelphia. She sent him a carefully worded letter, unsigned, hinting at corruption in Pittsburgh's medical establishment. She asked him to investigate St. Lazarus Hospital, to look into the unusually high fees charged by the facility and the suspiciously long terminal stays of wealthy patients. The reporter's name was James Mitchell, and he responded with interest. They arranged to meet in secret in a small cafe far from the hospital. Margaret brought copies of some of the less incriminating files, enough to prove that something irregular was happening without revealing the full scope of her involvement. James was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and ink-stained fingers. He listened to her story with growing alarm, taking notes in a rapid shorthand she couldn't read. "This is bigger than I imagined. If what you're telling me is true, this involves some of the most prominent families in Pennsylvania. Maybe the entire country." Margaret nodded. "That's why I need your help. I can gather evidence, but I can't expose it alone. They'll destroy me before I can say a word." James agreed to investigate further, to verify the information she provided before they took any public action. They arranged to meet again in 2 weeks. Margaret returned to St. Lazarus feeling, for the first time in months, like she had taken a step toward redemption. The reporter never showed up for their second meeting. Margaret waited in the cafe for 2 hours, her coffee growing cold, her anxiety building with each passing minute. She told herself he had been delayed, that some other story had demanded his attention. But deep in her chest, she felt a cold certainty that something had gone wrong. The next day's newspaper confirmed her fears. A small article on page 7 reported that James Mitchell, a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, had been killed in a traffic accident. His carriage had been struck by a delivery wagon on a busy street. The driver of the wagon had fled the scene and was being sought by police. Margaret's hands shook as she read the article. It could have been a genuine accident. Philadelphia's streets were dangerous, crowded with carriages and wagons and pedestrians. People died in traffic accidents every day. But the timing was too convenient. And when she returned to her room that evening, she found that her hidden notebook was gone. Someone had been in her room. Someone had searched through her belongings and found her careful records. Someone knew exactly what she had been doing. Margaret sat on her bed, trying to control the panic rising in her throat. She had been careful, so careful. She had never written down anything that could directly connect her to the reporter. She had never mentioned his name to anyone, but somehow they had found out. That night, Mrs. Blackwell summoned her to her office. The older woman sat behind her massive desk, Margaret's notebook open in front of her. She didn't speak immediately, just looked at Margaret with those cold eyes, letting the silence stretch and grow heavy. Finally she spoke. "I'm disappointed, Miss Sullivan. I thought we had reached an understanding. I thought you appreciated the opportunities we had given you." Margaret's mind raced. She could deny everything, claim the notebook was just personal observations, nothing more. But Mrs. Blackwell's expression told her that denial would be pointless. Instead, she chose a different approach. She met Mrs. Blackwell's gaze directly. "I couldn't continue being part of murder. Mr. Ashford didn't die of pneumonia. He was killed for his money." Mrs. Blackwell's expression didn't change. Mr. Ashford was dying anyway. Cancer. He had perhaps 6 months left, months of agony. His nephew simply requested that we help him avoid that suffering while ensuring the inheritance passed smoothly. It was a mercy, it was murder, and you know it. Mrs. Blackwell closed the notebook with a soft snap. Murder is such an ugly word. We prefer to think of it as medical intervention in service of familial harmony. But I can see that we're not going to agree on terminology. She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the dark city. Your reporter friend was another unfortunate accident. These things happen when people involve themselves in matters they don't understand. I hope you'll learn from his example. The threat was explicit now. Margaret felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. "What are you going to do with me?" Mrs. Blackwell turned from the window. "That depends on what you do next. You have 2 choices. You can accept what happened, destroy any remaining copies of your notes, and continue your work here with a proper understanding of your position. Or you can refuse, and we'll be forced to arrange for you to have your own unfortunate accident." Margaret's throat was so tight, She could barely breathe. There was no escape. They had trapped her completely. If she stayed, she became truly complicit in murder. If she tried to leave, they would kill her. But then she thought of something, a desperate gamble, but the only option she could see. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "I'll destroy the notes. But I want something in return." Mrs. Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate. I want to understand. I want to know why. How did this start? Who's really behind it? If I'm going to be part of this, I want to know everything." Mrs. Blackwell studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she smiled. "Very well. I think it's time you met the doctor." She led Margaret down to the basement, past the storage room where Margaret had first discovered the files, to a section she had never seen before. A heavy iron door stood at the end of the corridor. Mrs. Blackwell unlocked it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. Beyond the door was a laboratory. Not a hospital ward, not a storage area, but a fully equipped medical research facility. And in the center of that facility, surrounded by equipment Margaret didn't recognize, stood a man in a white coat. He was perhaps 60 years old, with white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes were bright with intelligence and something else, something that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Blackwell said formally, "allow me to introduce Dr. Cornelius Thorne, the true founder of St. Lazarus Hospital." Dr. Thorne smiled at Margaret with the warmth of a favorite grandfather greeting a beloved grandchild. The disconnect between his gentle demeanor and the sinister laboratory surrounding him made Margaret's stomach turn. He wiped his hands on a cloth and approached her with an extended hand, which she shook reflexively, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "Miss Sullivan, what a pleasure to finally meet you properly. Mrs. Blackwell has spoken highly of your technical skills and attention to detail. Please come in. Don't be afraid of the equipment. It's all perfectly safe." Margaret stepped further into the laboratory, her eyes taking in the strange apparatus. There were glass containers filled with fluids of various colors, mechanical devices with tubes and pumps, books and journals stacked on every available surface, and in the corner, partially hidden by a curtain, something that looked disturbingly like an operating table. Dr. Thorne noticed her gaze. "Ah, you're curious about my work. Excellent. Curiosity is the foundation of all scientific progress. Please sit. Let me explain what we're really doing here at St. Lazarus." Margaret sat in the chair he indicated, her hands gripped tightly in her lap. Mrs. Blackwell stood by the door, watching with an expression of satisfaction. The doctor began to pace as he spoke, his hands gesturing enthusiastically. "The wealthy families who come to us, they believe they're purchasing time. A few extra days, perhaps weeks, to manipulate inheritance laws and property transfers. And yes, we provide that service, but that's merely the funding mechanism for my true research." He paused dramatically, clearly expecting Margaret to ask what that research was. When she remained silent, he continued anyway. "I'm studying the boundary between life and death, Miss Sullivan. That threshold that medical science has always treated as absolute. But what if it isn't? What if death is not an instant transformation, but a gradual process that can be slowed, stopped, even reversed under the right conditions?" Margaret found her voice. "You're talking about bringing the dead back to life." "That's impossible." Dr. Thorne's smile widened. "Is it? Consider what we already know. The heart can stop and be restarted. Drowning victims can be revived after minutes without breath. I've read accounts from India of yogis who can slow their heartbeat to almost nothing and return to full vitality hours later. The line between life and death is far more blurred than conventional medicine admits." He moved to one of his glass containers and held it up to the light. "This solution can preserve tissue for weeks beyond normal decomposition. I've developed techniques for maintaining cellular integrity long after traditional death. And I've been studying the electrical properties of nervous tissue, the impulses that govern muscle movement and even thought itself." Margaret felt a creeping horror as she began to understand. The bodies upstairs. "The patients we care for. You're using them for experiments." "Not experiments," Dr. Thorne corrected gently. "Research. Every body that comes through St. Lazarus contributes to our understanding. The families get their legal manipulations, Mrs. Blackwell gets her fees, and I get subjects for study. Everyone benefits. "Except the dead," Margaret said. "Except the people who trusted doctors to care for them, to respect their remains." Dr. Thorne's expression hardened slightly. "The dead have no needs, Miss Sullivan, no rights, no consciousness. What we do with their remains is irrelevant to them and invaluable to science. Someday, perhaps soon, I will unlock the secret to reversing death itself. Imagine a world where no one need die prematurely, where fatal injuries can be undone, terminal diseases reversed. The lives I could save would number in the thousands, the millions, and all it costs is the dignity of corpses who cannot possibly care what happens to them." The logic was seductive in its own twisted way. Margaret could see how someone might convince themselves that the end justified the means. But she could also see the fundamental flaw. And Mr. Ashford? Did he volunteer to have his death hastened so you could study his remains more thoroughly? Dr. Thorne waved a dismissive hand. Ashford was dying anyway. We simply moved his timeline forward slightly to accommodate his nephew's financial needs and my research requirements. A mutually beneficial arrangement. You murdered him. I provided a medical service that prevented suffering and advanced human knowledge. Margaret stood abruptly. You're insane. This entire operation is built on murder and fraud and the desecration of the dead. And you've convinced yourself it's noble research. Dr. Thorne's expression turned cold. Mrs. Blackwell told me you were having doubts. I had hoped that understanding the larger purpose would help you see reason. Apparently I was wrong. He nodded to Mrs. Blackwell, who moved closer to Margaret. The older woman's hand went into her pocket, and Margaret saw the glint of something metal. You should have accepted my generous offer to simply continue your work, Mrs. Blackwell said quietly. Now we'll have to find another use for you. The doctor's research requires fresh subjects, after all. Margaret's body moved before her mind fully processed the threat. Years of nursing training had given her quick reflexes and knowledge of human anatomy. As Mrs. Blackwell's hand emerged from her pocket, holding a syringe filled with clear liquid, Margaret grabbed the nearest object, a glass beaker, and threw it directly at the older woman's face. The beaker shattered against Mrs. Blackwell's temple. She staggered backward, the syringe falling from her hand and breaking on the stone floor. Dr. Thorne shouted in alarm, but Margaret was already moving toward the door. She ran into the corridor, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Behind her she heard Dr. Thorne calling for help, his voice echoing through the basement. She knew the hospital's layout by now, knew that the main stairs were too far, too exposed. But there was a service stairway near the laundry, narrow and rarely used. Margaret's feet pounded against the stone floor as she ran. She could hear footsteps behind her now, multiple people. Mrs. Blackwell must have activated some kind of alarm. The entire night staff would be looking for her. She burst through the laundry room door, startling two women who were folding linens. Before they could react, she was through and into the service stairway, taking the stairs two at a time. Her lungs burned and her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. She emerged on the ground floor near the kitchen. Through the windows, she could see the night sky beginning to lighten with approaching dawn. The front entrance would be guarded by now. She needed another way out. The coal delivery entrance. It would be locked from the outside, but she could open it from within. Margaret changed direction, running through the kitchen as startled staff called after her. She found the delivery entrance and threw back the heavy bolt, shoving the door open with all her strength. Cold November air hit her face. She stumbled out into the alley behind the hospital, her nursing uniform offering little protection against the pre-dawn chill. Behind her, she heard shouts. They were close. Margaret ran into the maze of Pittsburgh's industrial district. The streets were just beginning to wake up, factory workers heading to early shifts, delivery wagons making their rounds. She tried to blend in, to look like just another worker hurrying to her job, but her white nursing uniform marked her as conspicuous. She needed to disappear to get far away from St. Lazarus before they found her, but she also needed evidence. Everything she had gathered was either destroyed or in Mrs. Blackwell's possession. Without proof, she was just a disgraced nurse making wild accusations against respected medical professionals. Then she remembered. The Philadelphia reporter had been investigating before he died. He must have written notes, filed preliminary reports. If she could get to Philadelphia, to his newspaper office, she might be able to find his research and use it to expose St. Lazarus. Margaret made her way to the railway station as the city came fully awake around her. She used the last of her savings to buy a ticket to Philadelphia on the morning train. As the train pulled away from the platform, she looked back at Pittsburgh's smoke-filled skyline and wondered if she had just escaped or if she was running toward even greater danger. The journey took most of the day. Margaret sat in the crowded third-class car, trying to make herself invisible among the working people traveling east. She had no luggage, no possessions, except the clothes she wore. Everything she owned was back at St. Lazarus in the room she would never see again. When she arrived in Philadelphia, she made her way to the offices of the Philadelphia Inquirer. The editor was skeptical at first when she asked about James Mitchell's investigation into Pittsburgh hospitals, but when she mentioned St. Lazarus by name and described some of what she had witnessed, his expression changed. He led her to a small office in the back and locked the door. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder. James's notes. Everything he had been working on before his death. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, correspondence with sources, preliminary outlines for articles. And there, in James's careful handwriting, were notes from their first meeting, names she had given him, details about the hospital's operations. But there was more. James had been investigating other hospitals, other doctors. St. Lazarus wasn't unique. It was part of a network that stretched across multiple states, all operating the same scheme. And at the center of it all was Dr. Cornelius Thorne, who had been experimenting on corpses for nearly 20 years. The editor looked at Margaret with something like awe. "Do you understand what you've uncovered? This is the biggest medical scandal in American history. If we can prove even half of what's in these notes, it will destroy dozens of prominent families and expose corruption that reaches into the highest levels of medicine and law." Margaret nodded slowly. "I understand, and I'm willing to testify to everything I witnessed, but we need to move quickly. They know I escaped. They'll be trying to discredit me, to make me disappear like they did James." The editor stood decisively. "Then we publish tomorrow, front page, everything. And we get you somewhere safe until the authorities can investigate properly." As Margaret helped him organize the evidence, compiling her memories with James's research, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not for herself. Perhaps her life was irreparably damaged by what she had done and witnessed. But hope that the truth would finally come to light, that the victims would get justice, that St. Lazarus Hospital and everyone connected to it would finally face the consequences of their crimes. The next morning, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran the story that would change American medical history forever. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.